Day 247 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another quick update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine today. And as always, I start off with the Russian military losses, so just to give you a bit of an idea of the exhaustion and the wearing out of the Russian forces there. So this is for the 28th of October 2022 in the last 24-hour reporting period, and we can see an additional 480 or so Russian military personnel losses there. Now, when we look at the hardware losses for the armored combat vehicles, an additional 14, tanks, an additional 9, artillery, additional 8 losses, 1 aircraft, and 2 choppers. And I'll mention something about one of those choppers in just a hot second there. Now, first of all, jump back to the map here. And we'll start out in the Donbass area today. So we'll zoom all the way in here. And last night in the occupied Krasnoyarchensky town of the Luhansk Oblast, so I'll zoom in, which there it is, right there. Russian soldiers reportedly started having an internal shootout of sorts near a store after they got drunk. The locals reported also that several were wounded as well, and in fact one was killed in the ordeal. And this is not the first time that something like this has happened. We have quite a few accounts now of unruly, drunken Russian soldiers effectively having shootouts. And we already know this, but leadership and morale in the Russian forces does leave a lot to be desired. Then slightly further down, here we go. So the Ukrainian forces repelled Russian assaults on Bilorivka today. So the one right there, settlement. The Russian forces basically failed and retreated. This is generally a common theme at the moment on the Donbass front line. As we move across down to Bakhmut, for instance, of course, still holds. Ukrainian forces continue to repel frontal assaults and inflict considerable losses on Russian forces here to date. In fact, I might just quickly pull out the date map, and there is an update since the last 2 days. So as we can see, this happened a couple of days ago. I think this is more of a clarification, but the Ukrainian forces pushed back the Russian forces past the M3 highway line a bit further, which is always good to see. Also, battles continue pretty heavily around Optine or Ivanrad, right there. Now, I'm zoomed in here, but just take a look at the distance here in terms of between Ukrainian-controlled and Russian-controlled. So I'll pull out the ruler, and we'll have a look. Whoop, if I can get that. Okay, less than a mile distance between what's fully controlled by Russia and what's fully controlled by Ukraine, thus making for some relatively close range fighting here right now. And also just a bit further below in Avdivka, there's Andrivka, so many similar names, and here we go. Found it finally. So although Russia appears to have quite the encirclement around here at Avdivka, and there is intense fighting going on here, the fight for Avdivka, if you will. It's been 8 months of fighting and no progress for the Russian forces here as yet. Now, all of this front line area that I'm showing you is effectively the Donetsk Oblast region of the Donbass. And what we do know and have been told by both the Ukrainian and Russian sides here is that the Russian mobilized units in this Donetsk frontline region are operating extremely poorly maintained T-62 tanks. Essentially, Russia took these 60-year-old tanks out of long-term storage, and that's not indoor storage, that's outdoor storage, and it's well reported that some of the Russian equipment sent to Donetsk is not even combat usable. In fact, just a week ago, the Ukrainian forces discovered Russian documents in Balaklia left behind from when when the Russian forces previously occupied that town. So you might remember Balaklia is up there. And some of the documentation showed that one of the Russian soldiers was being treated for finger and hand wounds after his Mosin rifle exploded in his hands. Now, Mosin rifles, of which are 19th century rifles and have been out of production for many, many decades. But they were provided in a non-functional capacity to many, many Russian forces. And this was even before the Russian mobilization. This was in the more acute phase of the beginning special military operation, where you would think Russia could supply a smaller number of units with enough modern and working equipment. But no. Then we'll move across to the nearby Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, Nikopol in particular. So Russian forces were shelling Nikopol quite heavily overnight from across the river, stationed at positions such as Vodane and Enohoda. Enohoda, that's right, the location of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. They love shelling from this location, at the same time shielding themselves with Europe's biggest active nuclear power plant. Have they no shame, really? Then we'll have a look at the adjacent region of Zaporizhia today. So this region feels like it has some element of a lawless jungle, perhaps, as far as many Russian forces are at least concerned. So, for instance, the Russian paratroopers, which are the airborne forces, which in other words are the ground forces that are normally carried by aircraft, then airdropped into battle zones, continue to complain about partisan movements in Kherson and Zaporizhia right here particularly. For instance, one was quoted as saying, and I quote, "Territorial defense in Kherson and Zaporizhia is such a story here. There are enemies around everywhere." And taking a look at this current ISW map certainly seems to show that in the occupied Zaporizhia Oblast, as indicated by the blue striped locations, that it does have its fair share of Ukrainian partisans or movements of these types. Meaning Russian soldiers stationed here constantly feel the need to be looking over their shoulders for any Ukrainian partisan movements. Then we'll move across to the precarious location of the Kherson Oblast, just next door. So starting off where Russian troops lost 2 ammunition depots in the Berislav district. So if I was to zoom in, that's just above the Dnipro River on the east side there. So here we go, Berislav. You've actually got some Russian headquarters here too at the moment. So Ukrainian HIMARS continue to target Russian positions on the front lines in the Kherson region, for instance with the above-mentioned Berislav, but also the logistics bridges that the Russian forces would otherwise like to use for crossing the river are still being targeted quite consistently by the Ukrainian forces. So the Antonivsky here and the Novokhovka, and the rail bridge right next to Antonivsky Bridge as well. But all in all, right here, right now, the Russian forces appear to have been reposturing into a more defensive, long-term position strategy due to having a more realistic assessment of the severely undermanned and undertrained Russian forces right at this location in Ukraine, thus making them only really capable of defensive positions right now. Oh, and also in this region, you might love this, just after I uploaded yesterday's video, shortly thereafter was a confirmation of yet another downed Russian Ka-52 Alligator chopper by the Yuki forces. Now, as with the other downed Russian choppers like this one, they fly in low to avoid Ukrainian surface-to-air missile systems to support their own Russian infantry. But when they fly low, they risk a close proximity hit by a manpad, such as a Stinger that's conveniently mounted on the shoulder of a Ukrainian soldier. So air superiority doesn't yet exist in this war for either side. But it would be good for Russia if they perhaps respected that fact a little more. Now we'll move across to some news for the day. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Russia has now launched over 4,500 missile strikes on Ukraine since February. That's nearly 20 missiles per day on average. He said this all while standing over a downed Iranian drone last night. He also said, quote, "Enemy planes will fall, enemy helicopters will fall, and Shaheds, the Iranian-made drones, will fall as well." Then he also went on to say, "Only the Ukrainian people will not fall." Obviously, them's fighting words. And in some other news, the US is to announce and send an additional $275 million in military aid to Ukraine. It will include thousands of rounds of ammunition for weapon systems already in use in Ukraine, including the HIMARS systems, which Ukraine has obviously been successfully using in their counter-offensive efforts in recent times. And some other big news in my opinion. So the Ukrainian General Staff has advised that Russia is to begin using most of its mobilized troops in 2 weeks. Now, Russia will hope to turn the tables on the front line battlefield in particular with this change in strategy, with this influx of Russian soldiers. Now, curiously, Russia was not able to support the logistics efforts early on in the war with a smaller force. So this will be tricky for them moving into the immediate future. And if you were watching my channel back on the 21st of September when Putin declared a partial military mobilization, I just knew and promised there and then that there would be countless mobilization blunder stories. And I show them to you all the time now as well. And so I say, in light of this new information, there will be countless logistics and supply blunders for the Russian forces soon as well. And you can take it to the bank that I'll be showing those. And in some more news, in an odd change of narrative, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said in his annual speech on foreign policy at a Russian think tank venue that he, quote, "never talked about using nuclear weapons." What? This is strange because Putin threatened repeatedly to use them in August and September time, and even more recently too. So I think this means that Putin is now lying about not saying a previous lie. That's confusing. He even said just 3 weeks ago he wasn't bluffing about using them, which is exactly what someone says when they're bluffing. So the paradoxical rabbit hole goes deep with this one, my precious. And all of which lead to the creation of this very meme, and it's one of my favorites. Then, speaking of mobilization blunders, I'll round this video off with a couple of quick ones today. So, in the bordering Russian oblast of Belgorod to the north of Ukraine, a mother of a mobilized soldier came to an administration building to protest. But she wasn't protesting the war. She was protesting and demanding that her mobilized son and other soldiers receive logs on the front line. Pure and simple logs. These logs are used to build proper trenches to provide some level of fire cover. And here we have police or security forces looking to put a stop to this obviously massive danger to society. And in the last quick mobilization blunder story of the day, so the Russian mobilized soldiers in this video recorded this, it's like a bit of a timid appeal requesting for basic necessities, including sleeping bags. So you've really got to wonder what is just going on with this army. And this is by no means an isolated incident. Every day there's something new in terms of poor treatment of these soldiers. Russia was not prepared for a mobilization or even a special military operation. Like when a Russian soldier was given expired rations, 7 years expired rations for that matter, and many of them, like I've mentioned just earlier, receiving 19th century Mosin rifles. So interesting stuff to say the least. Very curious. But that's about it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, subscribe, hit that like button. Thanks for all your support. It truly does take me 40 hours plus a week now to put all of these videos together every day. So yeah, thanks again for all of your support there. And I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.